Welcome, welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. The New Hampshire Council of Churches 2026 series is entitled Unmasking Christian Nationalism. This is a continuation of the Council's Christian Nationalism project, which began in 2025. Christian nationalism is the unholy alliance of powerful, well-heeled political operatives and leadership at many Christian non-denominational churches for the express purpose of moving us away from democracy toward authoritarian rule. And this has been going on for 5 decades. Underlying much of the Christian nationalist movement is the dominionist Seven Mountain Mandate, a very narrow and inaccurate Christian belief that Christians are called to influence or control seven spheres of society. That would be government, education, business, religion, family, media, and arts and entertainment. The Council of Churches says, no, thank you. And this year we are working to highlight how this white supremacist movement is impacting each of the spheres and ways for you to also join us in saying no, thank you. Tonight, we are focusing on the mountains of public education and business. We could not be more delighted to have James McKim and Zandra Rice Hawkins with us. James is a sought after organizational performance speaker, coach, change manager, frequent conference presenter, author of the best-selling book, The Diversity Factor, Igniting Superior Organizational Performance. He is an advisor to governors and legislators and a guest on radio and television shows, focusing on the topic of organizational performance through diversity. Over his 30-year career, he has helped small and large organizations through in many industries to spark efficiency and growth through the aligning of people, process, and technology. He excels at bridging business and technology. Among his many roles are chair of the Software Association of New Hampshire, member of the New Hampshire International Trade Advisory Board, chair of the Episcopal Church's National Executive Council Committee on Anti-Racism Reconciliation. He is past president of Manchester branch of the NAACP and chair of the New Hampshire Public Broadcasting Board Finance Committee. We are so lucky that you're here with us tonight, James. Zandra Rice Hawkins, our presenter on the topic of public education, is the founding executive director of Granite State Progress and Engage New Hampshire. Zandra developed her communications expertise with groups such as America Coming Together and New Hampshire for Healthcare. As a national organizer for Corporate Accountability International, she mobilized faith communities and organized shareholder actions to challenge the control of water and to protect our fundamental human right to water. Among her many awards are the Business and Professional Women of New Hampshire's 2009 Young Careerist, the New Hampshire Young Democrats Progressive of the Year 2018, the Merrimack County Democrats Mary Louise Hancock Awardee 2019, and a trove of other ones. She also received a National Campaign Leadership Award for her 2021 Campaign to Keep Guns Off Campus Award. Zandra is a former 3-term Concord City Councilor and recently finished multiple terms on the boards of Progress Now and the Millbrook and Broken Ground PTAs. A graduate of Gonzaga University, Zandra lives in Concord with her husband, Brian, 2 adorable, inquisitive children, and a fantastic native pollinator garden. And with no further delay, I would like to introduce James McKim to begin tonight's presentation. Thank you. Thank you so much, James.
All right. There we go. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. It is after 6 o'clock, so we can say good evening now. So pleased to be here with you as we dive into the Christian nationalism mountain of business. And I titled this really conversation. I'm not going to so much lecture you as facilitate a bit of a conversation about faith, power, and markets, which focuses on how Christian nationalist ideology is reshaping the business world. Um, and the lens I'm trying to take is not to be against religion in business, which may surprise a few people, but it's about what happens when a political ideology that fuses capitalism or fuses Christianity with national power starts to influence who belongs, which policies are lawful, and how organizations define merit, risk, and fairness. We've had a lot of conversation about meritocracy. So we want to delve into that a little bit. And what I'm going to invite you to watch for in terms of how you look at businesses and organizations, really. And some people make the distinction between for-profit and nonprofit organizations, and they call nonprofit organizations not businesses. I'm going to use the term business very broadly here. So businesses are, in my mind, also nonprofits. But what we want you to watch for is whether these organizations preserve pluralism. It's a fancy Latin word for um, different perspectives, really, while adapting to a harder edge legal and cultural environment that we find ourselves in over the last few years. Right? So that's kind of the setup for this time we're going to spend together. And we're going to spend about 20, 25 minutes on this topic, just to give you a bit of a lay of the time we have together. We're going to spend about 20, 25 minutes on this topic. And then we're going to have Zandra talk about the education mountain for about 25 or so minutes, 30 minutes. And then we're going to take a quick break and then shift into a couple of breakouts. We've got roughly what, 14 people here, I think is the number I saw or so. So we may do a couple of breakouts and have you talk about and think about what you might do in these two areas yourself based on what you've learned. And then we'll come back as a group and kind of share out, and Lisa will take us out at the end. So that's the layout for the time that we have together. Hopefully that will be helpful to you. So we're talking about the seventh mountain, which is defined by Christian nationalism's doctrine as the economy, corporations, and the workplace. Right? So I want to know a little bit about who's here, and I recognized a lot of the names, so I know some of who's here already. Um, how many of you is anybody here a business owner? Raise your hand if you're a business owner. I'm not seeing any hands. Okay, so are you an employee of an organization? Raise your hand. All right. Okay. And then the rest, um, consumers. Yes, everybody's really a consumer, right? Okay. So the reason I asked that because I can talk about this from a number of different perspectives, and I've got a lot of data here that's from a business owner's perspective. Uh, the way I'm going to couch this, though, because of who's in the audience, is what you should be expecting from business owners and understanding some of the challenges that they're facing. And what I'm going to end with what we as consumers can do as we think about businesses and how they operate. Right? So, from a business's perspective, why this matters, this should be a push that Christian nationalism is a push to privilege a particular Christian identity through law, through policy, and through corporate norms, right? Um, And so this matters because businesses effects are often indirect. We're hearing a lot of discussion about how billionaires are shaping our policies, right? So it's indirect. They're not elected officials, but business owners and the people in power tend to listen to business owners, people who are in power. But leaders are now facing a double challenge, expanding lawful religious accommodations while avoiding favoritism, coercion, or exclusion of non-Christian and non-religious employees. Because leaders recognize that they need to have multiple perspectives. The challenge for them is how to do that in this crazy world we now live in, right? So we need to think about how businesses can be both faith-friendly and pluralist. And a test we can use on these businesses is when problems emerge because of one faith or tradition, is it assumed that a response that will support and address one faith or tradition will support or address all faiths or traditions? Like that's a litmus test that you can use for a business and looking at an organization, right? A standard for belonging, respectability, and accountability and leadership needs to be pluralistic. So we have to think about state policy, we have to think about corporate governance, we have to think about workplace norms, culture, we have to think about market outcomes when we think about the business world. Right? That's what matters to businesses. State policies and federal policies, what are the guidelines in which I, as an organization, need to operate? What are the legal guidelines? What's my board saying? Boards have a major influence on what happens in the organization. In fact, they are responsible for what happens in the organization. Anybody here on a board? A few folks. And let me also say, it helps to have your cameras on if you can. Helps me to see to know whether what I'm saying is landing properly. But also helps to create community and help each other. So if you're on a board or have heard about boards, you know that boards have what's called a fiduciary responsibility. They are legally responsible for whatever happens in the organization. If the organization has a lawsuit and has to pay, and the organization doesn't have enough money in its coffers to pay, the board members themselves legally are liable. Right? So boards take their roles very seriously. They have that fiduciary responsibility, and they're held accountable by law. And we need to look at boards and how they operate. Right? So this is a bit of why, from the business perspective, it matters. What we have to really grapple with is that Christian nationalism is a significant and an organized, very, very organized force. Statistics from the Public Religion Research Institute, or PRI, and I'm going to quote them throughout my time here, um, have said that 1 in 3 Americans qualify as Christian nationalism adherents or sympathizers to Christian nationalism. 1 in 3. Think about that. 1 in 3 in this nation, right, are either adherents to or sympathizers. 54% of Arkansas in Arkansas is the highest state level support for Christian nationalism. 67% of adherents say immigrants are invading and replacing the culture. This gives you a sense of the magnitude of where we are, and that ideology overlaps with white identity and anti-Black sentiment, with patriarchal gender norms, with anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant attitudes, and this notion of authoritarianism and higher openness to political violence. So PRI, as I said, came up with these statistics of data across all 50 states. And the highest level of support was Arkansas at 54%, as we just mentioned. And you can see the next five in the top rankings. From Mississippi with 52%, Virginia with 51%, Oklahoma with 49%, and Wyoming with 46%. And the red color here, as you see in the key, red means voted Republican in the 2024 election. Blue means voted Democratic, and the kind of I guess gold is a battleground state. So, first question for you: where do you think New Hampshire falls in that ranking? Anybody? Type in the chat, or we're a small enough group, come off mute and share what you think. Anybody have a guess? Mid-range from Zach?
All right, I will say 15th.
15.
I would say about 30%.
I know it's going to be more than I want it to be.
Agreed.
27%. 27%. That's where we are in New Hampshire. Right? So PRRI finds stronger state level Christian nationalism where President Trump's favorability is higher and the Republican legislatures are in control. So it becomes a proxy for where policy and business pressure may be the strongest in those states. Policy, in terms of regulation and litigation, has changed. The policy environment has changed rapidly in just the last year or so. And the way that this has happened is that there's not just one federal level ban. It's a climate of legal uncertainty and compliance anxiety from multiple executive orders, from government contractors to HR teams and the Department of Labor. It's changed its policies and about how boards operate. Starting with January 21st to 31st back in 2025, the administration issued Executive Order 14-173, which revoked Executive Order 11-246. So here's the next quiz for you all. What was Executive Order 11-246? Anybody know? It was a 1965 presidential directive signed by President Lyndon B. Johnson that prohibited federal contractors and subcontractors from employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, and national origin. So this executive order from 2025 rescinded and revoked an executive order that's been in place since 1965. Right. April, federal contractors had 90 days to wind down their efforts and adhere to this revocation of 11-246. In February, March, we saw employers beginning to audit hiring, training, and disclosure. They were being really audited and criticized for having the diversity programs. This is when we started seeing the real backlash against DEI. In February of 2026, the Fourth Circuit rejected a broad challenge and let anti-DEI efforts proceed, which really, when the courts get into the mix, it's a powerful statement about how about the context in which organizations have to operate. And management implications are huge. And with those kinds of laws and decisions, many times businesses will overcorrect because they don't want to run afoul of the law, which is a real challenge. And we're seeing that overcorrection in many organizations. So question is then, where does this policy shift show up in businesses and organizations? Where do you think this policy shift shows up first in organizations? What functions in a business or in an organization do you think these policy shifts show up in?
Healthcare coverage.
Healthcare coverage
Hiring.
and hiring.
Promotions.
In promotions. And who gets promoted?
White folks,
White folks,
white men.
white men. We have layoffs in the chat because of it. So you got hiring and promotion. Religious accommodation suffers. Right? Not that it was very good to begin with, because do you know any organization that allows for the celebration of more than just Christmas and Thanksgiving and the traditional white holidays, Anglo-Saxon European holidays? Right? Many didn't before, and they're certainly not now in this environment. Training. DEI training's gone in many organizations. And any training that that recognizes plurality was really eliminated. And then somebody mentioned healthcare, so the benefits piece comes into play. So what's interesting here is that, Title VII still bars discrimination and harassment based on religion, still protects accommodations from the ACA, still prohibits job segregation based on religion, still forbids forcing an employee to participate in religious activity and conditions of employment. Title VII still exists, but it's butting up against these executive orders that are coming into place. And this is what's causing the uncertainty in organizations. Leaders don't know how to operate. Right? So the main risk here is religious freedom in the workplace becomes selective. It becomes whatever the owner, the business owner decides they want to, or the leadership decides they want to have as legitimate. So the recommendation here is to use one neutral accommodation protocol in terms of how you decide what holidays you're going to celebrate. What we look for in organizations, what I'm going to encourage you to look for in organizations that you might want to support, is what is their holiday policy? Does their holiday policy say that they have that they are off for Christmas, for New Year, for Thanksgiving, for Easter, and not say anything about Hanukkah? Not say anything about a Festival of Lights, right? And what many organizations have done is they've become generic. They've announced a generic policy where people can take off a number of days. They don't say what the holiday has to be. They say you have this number of days, use it, take them off as you see fit. Like that's the kind of generic policy that's a neutral accommodation. Corporate decision making is shifting under this governance pressure. We've seen DEI related proposals in state governments that have gone up from 2024 to 2025. And we've seen changes in corporate policy that have increased between 2024 and 2025, because they're increasingly seeing that the language that they've been using to show plurality is a threat. I think I'm gonna, oh, I have to get rid of this, dismiss this. And I've already talked about much of what's on the screen there. So I'm gonna go to the next slide. The broader economic effects of this constriction, these executive orders, these laws are being passed even at the state level, runs through contracting, procurement, and the capital that organizations need to be successful. So we've got in policy shift EEOs, the EO, the 14173, we have the contractor's response, changing hiring policies, changing training, procurement processes are being redesigned that had just begun to really look at diversity in suppliers, the supplying organization looking for diversity. What some organizations have done is to say, we're only going to use your products if you have a DEI policy in place. That's change because of this chill. So smaller, diverse vendors lose access to big clients, right? And from a local economy standpoint, what that means is more competition, fewer jobs, and a tax base that gets affected because people don't have jobs to pay taxes to keep the economy going. And so some statistics here at the bottom that show things like 168 billion was the spend with small and diverse suppliers from the federal government. Number of jobs supported by supplier diversity spend, 1.4 million. Total economic impact tied to that spending, $303 billion. Economic output generated by national minority-owned businesses, minority small businesses, $599.7 billion. Going away because of these regulations and this environment that we find ourselves in. So I'm going to skip this one and go to this next one because this is going to shift us into thinking about the marketplace itself. 75% of consumers globally say a brand's diversity, company's reputation and brand affects their purchasing decisions. How many of you make your purchasing decisions based on the reputation of the brand of the product? Hopefully all of you do. Right? That's one of the things that you can do. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. You can understand what's going on in that business that's producing that product or service based on the things we've just been talking about. And you can make purchase decisions. My sense is we as individuals have usurped our power and our responsibility to keep businesses in check. Right? We have purchasing power and we need to use it. And that's what actually, in the days of the civil rights movement, I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina in the early 60s. There was a big push for African Americans to only shop at certain stores in town. That was wielding economic power. We have to do that. 46% of people reported discrimination in the past year in their businesses, their organizations. McKinsey says that organizations that really engage in diversity, equity, and inclusion are 39% more likely to outperform their peers before EBIT, before earnings, before interest and taxes. Another research says that there's a 70% likelihood of capturing new markets by organizations that really live into diversity, equity, and inclusion and don't bend to this Christian nationalist fervor. So I'm going to skip this one and go straight to this one. What we need to look for in organizations is leadership that distinguishes inclusion from privileging, right? Supporting faith and belief expression, but not letting one religious worldview become the organization's de facto standard. We want to look for organizations, as I said, that are using a pluralistic approach that takes into consideration the beliefs and values of different religions, right? Not forcing prayer. And we have school districts that are doing this in the South, forcing prayer, putting the Ten Commandments up on a wall, right? We look at whether the language of the web page of a company has changed. The language of the brochures that they put out, has that changed? Are they continuing to track hiring and promotion and retention and complaints and pay equity for diverse people? What's their supplier policy? Who are they buying from? And how do they talk about pluralism in their organization? Is it as a strategic asset or is it as an expense? So the strategic question we need to be asking for these organizations is not whether a company has values that are about pluralism. It's whether they're holding themselves accountable for living into those values. That helps to create a diverse economy. So a little bit more, I'm going to wrap up with a little more on what we should look for. In terms of workplace and employment practices, look for a rollback in DEI programs, religious freedoms policies, etc. We talked about those. Look at where these organizations are donating. To whom are they donating? What legislation may their leaders be pushing? Right? Many of these big corporations have a department that's focused on advocacy. Advocacy for them. Look at the branding. Do the images that you see on brochures and on commercials, do they have women in positive roles? Do they have people of color in positive roles? Look at what the restrictions are about using products, where products are sold. Look at what information organizations are putting forth. Is there an ideology that you're seeing in that language? Are you seeing exclusionary narratives in their ads and in the brochures? Look for transparent reporting of what's their employee base. Companies put out, public companies put out an annual report every year. Nonprofits put out an annual report every year. Read it. See what's in it. See how they describe their values and how they're living into those values. So with that, I'm going to kind of end here with a closing thought. When one religious national identity becomes the template for merit, as we hear about this meritocracy, right? What constitutes merit? Well, a religious belief does not constitute merit. But when one religious national identity becomes a template for merit, belonging, and legitimacy, that's when businesses are not being neutral anymore. And they're reproducing political hierarchy. We want organizations that protect faith, fairness, and plural markets all at the same time. And it's not an easy balance. It's not to say it's easy, but that's what we want to look for. So questions I want you to think about, and hopefully give you some time to think about these in the breakouts. Think of an organization that you're involved in. Where did that organization move to overcorrect? What policy changes happened? What culture changes happened? What would a truly viewpoint neutral accommodation standard look like for that organization that you're part of? What stakeholders, relationships between the stakeholders involved with that product are most vulnerable to pluralism weakening? Because that's the Achilles heel for that organization. Right? Look for weaknesses in the organization, not just strengths. So those are some questions I want you to think about, along with some of the other things we've talked a bit about here. This is not only moral. The research shows that organizations that are living into the pluralism are more profitable, more successful in the long run. That's what I got.
Wow, we could chew on that for a couple of hours. That was fantastic, James. Why don't we all give a round of applause and hit buttons of applause and thank you. We have a lot to cover, so we're just going to jump in with Zandra Rice Hawkins, who will be unveiling for us or unmasking for us the impact of Christian nationalist ideology on public education. And thank you so much, Zandra, for being with us tonight.
I am glad to be here. It is always great to hear James speak and also always hard to follow him. So we'll do my best. For those who don't know me or jumped on a couple minutes after the intros, I'm Zandra Rice Hawkins. I use the pronoun she, her. I'm with Engage New Hampshire, which is an education justice organization working to protect and advance public education. And our goal is for fully funded, honest, and inclusive public schools where every student can thrive, belong, and thrive, which is really, really critical to their learning experience. I'm going to go ahead and context this part of the conversation in Project 2025 and the goals that the Trump administration and its allies laid out going into the 2024 election and how that has played out in the first 18 months of the administration. I'm going to talk a little bit about how New Hampshire has been either a target of or an enabler of some of that agenda and where we stand. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the resources and materials that can help us kind of move past this. One of the things I would just start off by saying, and if you go to the mountain mandates that James talked about at the beginning, and education clearly is one of those pillars, is no surprise that school privatization, being able to use religious and private schools or home schools or other options like that, is part of the Christian nationalist agenda. That is to quote unquote protect their kids from exposure to frankly, other ideas and communities and experiences. And what we're seeing in our state and in our country right now is that being supercharged with the current policies that we are seeing come down from the national level as well as the state level. Another important note for those who are less familiar with this, I'm going to drop in after I do my presentation links to two things that may be helpful for people. If you hadn't had a chance to be a part of our previous Countering Christian Nationalism events, we did a screening of Bad Faith, which is a incredible film that goes through the history of Christian nationalism and with a really heavy emphasis on public education. So I highly recommend it to people. And then I'm also going to drop in the Education Council's Project 2025 tracker. So I'll kind of hit some highlights, but if you are interested in seeing literally every policy suggestion around public education and where it lands right now. We have some incredible partners at the national level who are compiling that information for us. And so I wanted to give a shout out to them. So I'll put both those resources in the chat. But kind of starting off that conversation around Christian nationalism and public education, we really saw this take a definitive form after the Brown v. Board of Education ruling, where frankly, we saw there'd already been segregated schools, but now we saw this push for more school privatization, more segregation. And within a couple of decades, you had like the emergence of the moral majority, a conservative political and advocacy movement that didn't talk about public education in that way at first, because even they recognized that promoting segregated schools and racism was not a good start for their campaign. So you saw them take on issues like abortion, and they didn't want sex education in schools. You saw them talk about things like having parental choice, which we still hear today, religious freedom, school choice, talking about dollars following students. And those type of activities have continued through today with what we're dealing with book bans, the anti-critical race theory hysteria that happened a few years ago, the attacks on trans students. So there's this real thorough line of where a lot of that organizing and resistance first came out of, to having thriving public schools where all students could attend from all backgrounds and get a quality education. The Project 2025 proposal is one of the most extreme plans we've seen yet. So some of these things, and folks may remember this from, when it was a little bit more in the news, eliminating the Department of Education, which we have seen movements to do that. One of the things that has happened is the Trump administration has been moving parts of the Department of Education into other departments like Department of Labor, Health and Human Services, to try to pull out and really gut it from the inside. Getting rid of all teachers' unions. So there's some language in there around revoking the National Educators Union Association's charter, which is actually a federally mandated and created union charter. Tearing down guardrails around education spending, so allowing for more use in religious and private institutions, also in charter schools. Charter schools are an interesting one because I think our experience in New Hampshire is a little different than in other places. We were just talking to some partners in Arizona that said all of their charter schools have been taken over by white Christian nationalist groups. That is literally who runs charter schools in their district. And we've seen at the state level here a real effort to potentially even change all of our public schools into charter schools. That's one discussion that's been had at the state level. And the idea is there's fewer guardrails and there's more opportunity for that kind of right-wing influence. Also, Project 2025 partnered with groups that'll probably be well known to folks here. Moms for Liberty, which, kind of acts as like the forward-facing, we'd call it an AstroTurf group, some well-paid influencers and organizers to say that they are parents of students and that these are parental rights. What we find in New Hampshire is often the folks involved in those types of organizations don't have kids in public schools, have never had kids in public schools, or either private school users or homeschoolers. And then there's other partners that also weighed in at the federal level on Project 2025. The first sentence of the chapter on the Department of Education states, federal education policy should be limited, and ultimately the federal Department of Education should be eliminated. It talks about the expansion of school vouchers. It talks about removing federal oversight for funds under Title I, and said handing them to states with no regulation oversight. So Title I schools are schools that are struggling financially. They're in lower income communities. A lot of the students need services or supports like free and reduced meals, additional educational supports. And having that go to a state grant process where there is no federal regulation or oversight is really dangerous for the quality of education for those students across the nation, because not every state is going to have the same standards, and we're going to have to continue to have the same fights that we have already had about what those pieces should include. There's also a current proposal to make federal education funding for students with special needs to be converted to unregulated block grants. This one is also extremely concerning. We've also seen this type of proposal in healthcare in the past around like Medicaid block granting, but again, undervaluing regulations and guidelines. And the reality is the federal government has never paid its fair share, its promise of support services to begin with. So not only is this a dereliction of their duty to do so, but turning it into block grants will just continue to embed that underfunded policy going forward. So very similar to the business, we saw across all of the pillars proposals to eliminate anything around diversity, equity, and inclusion, or so-called critical race theory, and specifically under public education to get rid of any federal rules or legislation for the term diversity, equity, and inclusion. In the forward for this section, the public education section, it says the next conservative president must make the institutions of American civil society, quote, hard targets for woke culture warriors. And that starts with deleting terms, and it goes on to put it in the language that they would use, but basically to make it harder for us to have conversations about equity and resource allocation and making sure in our schools that all students are receiving what they need and have a place of belonging in our public schools. What has not happened to the same degree, but is in the Project 2025 proposal, is a call to investigate and prosecute DEI offices and officers. And so one thing we saw very early January, February of last year were calls for school districts across the state or across the nation to list out every program, contract, initiative that included DEI. And thankfully, that had a quick court block around that. But two things that happened out of that. One, some school districts did it because they were worried about meeting the deadline about what would happen. Two, that was posted publicly on some websites, those responses. So like some of the state Department of Education and federal pages, and basically gave a roadmap for groups like Moms for Liberty and others to then go in and try to target these school districts. And so there's a lot of kind of collaboration happening in the world of Christian nationalism to attack these institutions from the policy level, from the legislative level, from the ground level, and make life very, very challenging for our public school administrators and families. Specifically on LGBTQ students, this is a very concerning area. Federally, they're seeking to eliminate federal protections for queer people and students. Project 2025 lays out plans to criminalize being transgender, as we have seen lots of policies and changes. So James mentioned checking websites for language changes. The federal government websites have completely wiped clean language around transgender individuals in our communities, research, health data, other things, and that it's impacting our students as well. This one It's not the first time the Trump administration had proposed that type of idea about trans people losing protections under under anti-discrimination laws. And one of the things that we're seeing currently happening is a repeal of some of the a rollback of some of the Title IX protections that trans students were using to be able to be full and equal participants in their school community. And there are ongoing legal challenges around a lot of these pieces. They also have threatened but have not pursued at the federal level potentially imprisonment of individuals who use LGBTQ inclusive language or have books that talk about LGBTQ and particularly trans experiences and histories. And while we haven't seen that play out quite the same at the federal level, there are states like Texas where public librarians are very concerned about some of the state laws that have passed there, that they are personally liable and can be sued based off of the books that they keep in the library. Under school privatization, this is a huge part of it. In New Hampshire, we already have school vouchers. They divert millions of taxpayer dollars each year away from our public schools and into private and religious schools that do not have to have the same non-discrimination policies. They don't have to have the same types of standards that our public schools do. They don't have to have the same type of educator accreditation as our public schools do. So a really imbalanced system to begin with, but one that can really harm students in lots of different ways, in addition to underfunding our local public schools. We also have here Learn Everywhere and micro schools and innovation schools, and we have PragerU, which is a right-wing Christian nationalist basically YouTube channel that I actually encourage people to go take a look at it, only to see the types of information that they are sending. And I will tell you, as a parent of two elementary age public school students, I do get served the ads from PragerU from time to time, and talking about Sophia's journey, Sophia's family's immigrants, and why they wouldn't come across undocumented, and just like really like trying to tell one type of perspective or story that isn't really in line with the reality or the experiences of people in our world today. At the New Hampshire level, on the school privatization, the other thing that has happened is that at the federal level, they did pass federal school vouchers. And so there will have to be there's still rulemaking going on, and there'll have to be a formal opt-in, but Governor Kelly Ayotte has already said that she will be opting New Hampshire into those. And so one of the things that we're concerned about, just on the funding piece of it, again, the diversion of public taxpayer dollars to private and religious schools instead of public schools, but also lots of questions about again, guardrails and accountability. So some of the things that we have seen nationally around school vouchers are, jet ski purchases, Disneyland tickets, vacations. In New Hampshire, Amazon's one of the largest vendors for the program. So, if you really want to talk about, just kind of flooding, dismantling public education, using taxpayer dollars for things that should not be used for, and also not giving these kids like a real education and an opportunity for the future. All of these things are unfortunately happening right now at the federal and state level. Just to bring it back down a little bit about some of those federal policies to the state. So as you all already know, we already have major gaps in public school funding across our state. So these policies are only going to continue to hurt communities, hurt public schools from the diversion of funds, and further hurt public schools because as our property taxes continue to grow because of the lack of funding for public schools, that is going to continue to put the squeeze. As support services or special education is not funded at the state and federal level, that is going to put a squeeze on us. We are seeing lots of pressures at the local level right now, and to the point where some of our communities are in real jeopardy of potentially losing their public schools. And I think the situation up in Claremont, New Hampshire, there were some other things at play there. But the reality was that school did not have enough of a buffer to rebound when it got into some financial trouble. And if it had not been for a loan from a local bank, that community would have lost its local school district, its local public school. And so these are problems that we're going to start to see more and more. And these policies at the state and national level, really embedded in Christian nationalism policies and ideologies, is just going to continue to be that stranglehold. On the DEI at the state level, we did have a statewide ban on honest education pass in 2021. Thankfully, a court struck it down, federal court struck it down, ongoing litigation. James McKim, one of the plaintiffs, I'm very thankful for his work and effort there. We have got lots of opportunity to challenge that, but the reality is, and again, I think we saw this question around the business piece, even if the policy does not go into effect, the chilling impact of it does. And so all of a sudden you have educators or school administrators who are nervous about getting to the line of what they think may draw ire and make their school community a target. And so they're going to be a little more cautious. I know that we had questions. We did a conversation with educators in the couple of years after the passage of that law, questions about what they could share for Black History Month, questions about books on their shelves, questions about pride flags in classrooms, things that they were doing to teach kids an honest and accurate history, to make sure all students felt a sense of belonging and acceptance in their classrooms. And that is extremely concerning. And it's more concerning because we already know that we are at a deficit for teaching an accurate history about our country. So to have these pieces, whether or not that they actually go into effect, really is dangerous. We did just defeat at the State House, and I say we as in like everybody doing this work, an effort to renew that ban. There were a couple different proposals in the State House and in the Senate. Thankfully, they couldn't agree, and we're going to take that as a win to not move forward, but certainly concern. Transgender sports ban passed in New Hampshire is also under ongoing litigation. One initial court cases, those court cases allowed the students who were part of the court case to continue to play school sports, but is not something that necessarily protected all students. Although thankfully many school districts have kind of accepted it as that's what's going to happen, and so have allowed those transgender students to continue to play. But we are facing at the state level right now the very real possibility that we are going to have a bathroom ban pass, and this will apply to schools and publicly funded institutions. And there's a strong campaign happening right now for governor veto, but a lot of concern and a lot of conversation. This is one of the action items folks can think about. Should that law come to pass at the state level, what do we do to help support trans individuals out in public spaces, to make sure that they feel safe and supported in trying to just do a very simple thing of using a public restroom? So I would ask folks to really be thinking about, again, the chilling impact and threat of these policies, both for passage and for the concerns that they raise up for communities. The last thing on here is just we have seen a lot of attempts at the state level to dismantle and undermine public schools by also lowering standards, trying to make education piecemeal. Again, as a mother of two, young students, one of the things that we see a lot of happening is kind of trying to push families into you need to pick out all these programs and individual classes. It is really honestly, it is not to help support your students' learning because it's not consistent. It's really time intensive for parents, families to try to figure that out. But it is to divert our attention and our ability to come together and organize for more appropriate or more important priorities as a community. And so there's lots of different pieces of this type of activity that is harming us. There's also going to be a conversation this summer that I'll flag for folks. There have been over the last couple of sessions many attempts to lower homeschooling standards in the state, and there's not necessarily, uh, as of yet, and we're going to try to put this together this summer, but a community to really come together across many different kind of vantage points to say, if we really believe that education is a bedrock of our democracy, that these kids, that we need to make sure every child in our community is safe and learning and thriving, then we also need to make sure that kids who are outside the public education system are not being left behind because they're not having any of the supports or oversight that they need to guarantee that they're going to get an appropriate and adequate education. So we're also very concerned about things even outside the public schools that are going to harm that ability for our future civic leaders. The last piece I'll just talk about for appointments. Much of the Project 2025 at the federal level, no surprise, talks about putting allies of Christian nationalism into places of importance. And these are, commissions, department positions, advisory boards, and we are actually seeing a lot of that in New Hampshire as well. So our immediate past education commissioner, Frank Edelblut, didn't support public education or public schools. He was a culture war parental rights, so-called parental rights advocate. Our New Hampshire State Board of Education chair, Drew Klein, is the president of the Josiah Bartlett Center, which promotes school privatization and anti-DIJB efforts and all these culture war fights. Our new New Hampshire Supreme Court Chief Justice, Gordon MacDonald, is a former board member for the Josiah Bartlett Center. Our new Supreme Court Justice, Anna Barbara Hance Marconi, now has stepped back, but also was the board vice chair for Josiah Bartlett Center. And then just last fall, added Brian Gold, who was a frequent New Hampshire GOP lawyer. And in the conversation about whether or not he should be appointed, was a belief among kind of the political chattering class that he was being nominated specifically because of his view on the Constitution and the fact that they thought that he would overturn the landmark Claremont education funding decision. And now we're seeing court rulings that make us very concerned. Let me just make sure I hit all of these real quick. Yes. Oh, the Trump administration also has currently delayed over $10 billion in K through 12 grants. So that is definitely something that we are trying to deal with. And they have on higher ed, which I didn't really chat about as much, but they have implemented either partially or fully implemented roughly 1/3 of their goals on higher education. And a lot of that is executive orders or policy changes that don't always have to go through Congress. So lots and lots of concerns there. I did want to leave folks with just like, I always like to leave with a hopeful note here because this is some scary big stuff. I will say, despite all of that at the federal and state level, we do have a lot to be hopeful about, and particularly when it comes to public education. Over the last 5 years that we have been working very heavily on education justice, community after community has come together. So at the local level, we have won almost every fight that we have helped work on. Folks, Milford, New Hampshire, protecting transgender students, community members coming out to say, have pride in your community. We were able to defeat the first couple of rounds of parental Bill of Rights at the State House with bipartisan support. The legal team is just up and running on striking down bad law after bad law. Credit, tip of the hat to ACLU New Hampshire, which is just at the forefront, truly not just leading our state, but really at the forefront of national legal action to kind of try to keep us on the right track. So we also have, book ban legislation that we were able to get Governor Ayotte to veto last summer, and we're hopeful we can do it again with the bill headed to her desk now. So when we come together, when we mobilize, when we educate our communities, we are making progress. So in the face of all of this, I just want to leave folks with that note that it's not a foregone conclusion about the end of American democracy. We're going to build back, hold the line, build back stronger and better, and achieve that multiracial democracy that we have been promised for so long, right? We're going to get there.
Thank you so much. Lots of meat, lots of juice, lots of stuff to chew through. I am going to make a moderator decision and recommend that we go into conversation. We have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, about 3, 6, 9, 12 of us, rather than go into breakout rooms, because we are at just about 7:40. And I have been preparing a slide with some ways that you can get involved, and we can add to that too. How does that sound, James? How does that sound, James and Zandra?
That sounds good. We've got a small enough group that we can just stay here.
Yeah. So, would really appreciate it if those of you who are on video might be willing to join us for the conversation, and let's unhide yourself if you would, please. And let's start with questions. We have one in the chat from earlier on, and it says way back toward the top. What about businesses that rely on government funding and are threatened by the loss of funding if they imply that they support DEI?
James, I think that one is for you, but I put my
Yes.
my frustration about pre-complying in the chat.
I asked that question because I have a friend who works for a for the community health center. And they got the word they must clean up anything that says DEI or lose funding.
Mhm.
And how do you fight that? What do you do with that? I mean, it's
So
like, yeah.
what my recommendation to organizations that I work with is, and I have so many conversations with organizations about this, you can continue to do the work, you just have to use different language. So diversity, from my perspective, is really about diverse perspectives. And one way that you get diverse perspectives is to have a diverse set of people. So you can say things like, we need diverse perspectives in our organization, and we need to have a staff, for example, that reflects our audience, our users, the people we serve. You can say things like that. And so you're not using the word diversity directly, but you're having the same impact, you're having the same effect, you're going after the same concepts. Um, it's a bit of verbal jujitsu is the phrase that's sometimes used, but it can work. And people, this push against DEI, if you ask these folks who are pushing back, what 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 is DEI? They have a hard time describing what it is. And so one of the things that the HB2, the language that went in, tried to do is they tried to define DEI. Right? And the definition they gave was nothing like what anybody who's practicing says it is or does it. So that's one of the reasons why Judge McCafferty said, no, that doesn't make sense. It's too vague. Um, so that's why I say look not just at the language, and the language is one thing you can look for in the brochures and on the websites and whatnot, but you have to sometimes dig deeper. What are their policies and procedures? What's the work they're actually doing? Because a lot of these organizations actually, they had a chief diversity officer as the title. Well, when the word came down that you couldn't use diversity, did they let the people go? In large corporations, some of them, yes, but in middle-sized organizations, no, they did not let the people go. They just changed the title of that person. So they became community engagement director or some language like that. They're doing the same work. They just have a different title.
Thank you, James. Next question.
So I have an unformed question, I think.
It's okay.
And it largely stems from the fact that, I'm fairly new to New Hampshire. Lived my whole life until a year ago in Massachusetts. And from in my 1 year experience here, New Hampshire is not a terribly diverse state in my estimation. So I'm wondering, I'm just wondering how this all plays out in a state like New Hampshire where there is not as much diversity. So, there's not as much diversity in the school system. There's very little diversity, that I can see in businesses in this state. And there is very little diversity in faith communities. So I'm wondering how to measure these things that you're asking us to measure, right? How do you measure it in a state with such low diversity?
I'm going to jump all over this one. I am going to ask you to change your definition of diversity because colloquially people think it's race or maybe gender. And diversity is so much more than that. I love using the diversity wheel that Marilyn Loden came up with in 1991 when she was at Johns Hopkins Institute. And she focuses on personality characteristics. Diversity is really about different personality characteristics, not just race, not just gender. So we have age, we have socioeconomic status, we have marital status, we have educational status, disability, so many different perspectives. And if you look at diversity that way, New Hampshire and all places have, well, I shouldn't say all places. New Hampshire has plenty of diversity. It may not have a lot of racial diversity, except if you go to Manchester, New Hampshire, Census Tract 15, do you know what the percentage of African Americans is in that census tract? 20%, as opposed to the state's percentage being about 6%. So we want to be really careful when we say we don't have diversity here. We've got plenty of diversity, and depending upon the area you're focusing on, we actually have racial diversity as well. So how that plays out at the state, in the state is, we have a lot of rural towns that don't have a lot of racial diversity, don't have a lot of socioeconomic diversity even. But then we have places like Manchester, which is the most diverse school district in the state. And the tension, we had a bill in the state house that tried to limit the amount of funds that went to the city of Manchester to have programs that would support minorities.
Mhm.
The state tried to tell the city how much money it could spend. So that's a tension. That's what's going on in New Hampshire. The state is trying to and this is actually a Republican mantra, trying to butt its head into places where it shouldn't be.
Mhm. And I'll just add on that. I knew I had missed. I knew in my notes I'd missed one point, and one of the things I wanted to say is the part of the public education concerns right now is just the rollback of memos protecting arrests, ICE arrests around in and around schools. And going to Manchester, we had a scare a few months ago where there was a belief that ICE was going to be coming, and
Into the schools, yeah.
uh, we had a lot of students and families not show up to school that day. And I live here in Concord. We have a large refugee resettlement population. So there, again, to James' point, pockets of different, communities that will be, more harmed than others, but also the difference in how we think about diversity. I'd also say it's also we have more work to do in a state like New Hampshire, where we don't have some of the types of day-to-day interactions or overt actions, because we have to not get complacent. We need to be working and making sure that even if the experience I have, it's not the same experience another community member has, and it might not be in our as visible to us as it may be in some other states around the nation. And so we have more work to do to make sure that we are dismantling Christian nationalism when and where it shows up.
And if I can just add to that too, we have many people here who say there is no racism because we don't have enough people color to have racism here. Well, yeah, we do, right? You just don't see it.
I will just also, Jennifer, are you a member of the clergy?
Yes.
Yes. So what I will say as the executive director of the New Hampshire Council of Churches is my observation is that the seven mainline denominations do in fact have less socioeconomic diversity here in New Hampshire for sure. I don't want to minimize that. I will also point out for you as you look around rural communities, hiding poverty in rural communities has become a high art in New Hampshire. It exists, and it exists in places like Hollis and Amherst, and Portsmouth, probably less so Portsmouth, because it's so hyper gentrified, but and also people with disabilities make up 20% of the state of New Hampshire. So that's, yeah, but I do want to validate that the lack of socioeconomic diversity in the mainline churches is strikingly visible. Is there another question? Go ahead, Gail. Thank you.
I had put this in the chat too, towards the end. And that is, I am also relatively new to New Hampshire, but I've started hearing about the free staters, people who've what I've heard is that these are a group of people who've deliberately moved to New Hampshire. They targeted this state to, affect their agenda, which is probably very much in 2025. Are
Yep.
these a real group of people? Are they having a real effect?
Yes.
And I understand that they don't always identify themselves.
Yes, so I will jump into this a little bit. Little nugget of good news to start the conversation on. The Free State branch of the United States Libertarian Party was just kicked out at their national convention. So that's a thumbs up good news. So it is in fact true that about 20 years ago, um, a very extreme group of authoritarians under the guise of liberty, decided to make New Hampshire literally the Free State Project because they saw a lot of opportunity to buy homes at the time that were less expensive than in other states. And they wanted to transport 20,000 people. And they had national funders that paid for moving costs and helped with down payments. And then they infiltrated zoning boards, town select boards, and now there are, what, 60 of them. They hide under the banner of the Republican Party. And at this point, they are a dominating feature and have New Hampshire's Republican Party in a vice grip with their extreme, irrational, quote unquote, liberty. But the degree of hatefulness, uh, xenophobia and white supremacy that comes out of the mouths of these folks, and I'll just name anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, like all of it, is alarming and disturbing. If you want to learn a good deal about this in a small chunk of time, you want to look for Gene Deitsch, Dietsch. Gene Deitsch has an excellent PowerPoint presentation and a very short, readable book. And they are, as I put in the chat, a colluding partner with Christian nationalist ideology. Because, and here's the learning edge for Democrats or people who care about belonging, access, and inclusion. These folks have been executing a strategic plan for 5 decades. And if they lose a small battle in the short term, they are looking to win the war, and they keep on keeping on and re-strategize and replan. So we need to take a play out of that highly effective playbook, right? The Free Staters are in alliance with this rebranded white supremacy, now known as Christian nationalism, because for 5 decades they have plodded along, infiltrating at the state, local, and federal level. And now they can, in New Hampshire, they have controlled the New Hampshire legislature. They have controlled the governor's office for 10 years. And now they've got themselves parked at the New Hampshire Supreme Court. And on the federal level, right now, they control the Supreme Court, the federal, the executive office, as well as the legislature. So those of us who care about equity, opportunity, inclusion, we can take some plays by staying focused and staying clear on the way we spend our time, the way we spend our money, and how we vote, right? We have to vote with the folks who are most in alignment with our values. And we always, always, always need to be thinking about low-income students, people with disabilities, Black and brown bodies, undocumented immigrants. We need to be thinking about Medicaid. We need to be thinking about the medically fragile. We need to think about seniors who eat cat food, people who ration their insulin. And we need to vote for the folks who are best going to protect their lives, literally their lives.
And the trans community.
The trans LGBTQ community, all of the vulnerable population.
Trans.
Economically privileged, and especially white economically privileged folks, always need to be bearing in mind, I'm going to vote for the person in my life who is most vulnerable and set aside my intellectual self-righteousness, and I'm going to get out and get involved and show up in November after I've done volunteering. Another question? Go ahead, Lois.
Thanks, Lisa. I think it was you, Zandra, who brought up how we can support the trans community if the bathroom bill is passed into law. Um, it's really the most prominent thing on my mind right now, just because of some volunteering in another program I've been doing, but I don't know that how close they are, but I do know that Texas is trying to, as we speak, pass a law to make being transgender illegal, being pornographic, being. So we're talking, and there, by the way, is already the formation of an underground railroad for transgender people needing to escape Texas and wherever it spreads, because it'll spread like lightning once it passes somewhere in the South. We know that's going to happen. But my point of bringing all this up is that that will be the triggering mechanism to start what I consider the beginnings of another turn toward genocide. Now, it's not necessarily going to be a physical genocide. It is going to be a genocide of the personhood of human beings who do not gender conform to the white Christian national expectation. And it's coming. And if it starts there, we know what happens. First, they came for,
Yep.
and it wasn't me. And then,
Yep.
and this is what we're looking at. We're looking at a trigger mechanism that is going to mean that we do need to start planning on how to ally visibly, peacefully, but visibly and strongly now, because it's coming soon.
I
This
agree
kind of need,
100%.
it's upon us almost.
And I
I
think for
just,
younger generations in particular, like, I think it'll be hard on everyone, but for youth who have been able to um, hopefully live their life a little bit more authentically than many folks who are, farther along in life have been able to. We're seeing a real mental health crisis among youth, and
oh,
this is one of the
yeah,
contributing factors
yeah.
for our LGBTQ youth. Going to what James said about the business community, some of the conversations around that are what can businesses do to make sure that they are creating welcoming, affirming spaces for all individuals in our community, in addition to like the campaign I'll Go With You, like literally, finding ways to be thoughtful about making sure we have more presence, uh, and being thoughtful and aware of who we are around in public spaces who may be uncomfortable in the situation they're in. But I am, yeah, also very concerned about it.
Yes, thank you, Lois. I will just add that when you cut $1 trillion from Medicaid, it's not the same visual violence as what's happening with ICE raids, but that is absolutely proof that they are coming after the disability community, and they are literally beginning killing us, and they will continue killing us slowly through 1,000 cuts. And because it's not visually alarming, it's harder to lift up the ways in which the disability community is having a sword taken to its throat. I created something because we're at 8 o'clock, and I would love for um, James and Zandra, because we want to end with making sure that you all know that there are ways to plug in. And I was putting this together while listening to you, Zandra, because uh, Zandra and James and I have been putting together countering Christian nationalism programs for over a year now. It's a great group of us in the coalition to counter Christian nationalism. And these are some, and Zandra and James, if you want to popcorn out a couple of other ways, then I can add those in. So um, when the slides go out, we'll have a slightly more complete list.
I threw a couple more in the chat. There, I think, are probably some that are overlapping. But one thing I just want to remind folks about that we have kind of talked about back and forth in some of the previous uh, presentations of the Countering Christian Nationalism Coalition. One of the things that we can be most helpful is in building local teams that are ready to proactively or in rapid response situations work together when we see situations occur. And I'll give just like a very prime example that here in Concord, I've been a part of a team like that for about 5 years now. And when we knew neo-Nazis were coming to demonstrate outside of the Teetotaler in downtown Concord during a drag story hour with children, within 24 hours, we were able to mobilize by calling. We had a plan together. We knew who to call in the community to get community leaders and supporters out there. And we knew how to work with the media because we had done training to say, don't talk about the neo-Nazis showing up, talk about how our community responded to say that everyone belongs here and that we protect and support our LGBTQ neighbors. And that was how the story played out. And that was one of the visuals we had. So just really encouraging folks, you don't have to have an immediate thing that you're doing, even just working to make sure we've got our affinity groups ready to work together on something. And Lisa and James and I have all been working with pockets of folks in different communities to help prepare for that. And there's going to be an upcoming series called the Hope PV training through the New Hampshire Council of Churches that I highly recommend that will help train you on how to set up that team. So.
Yep. And if you just wanted to remind everyone that there are a number of groups that are looking for volunteers. Some are just, open democracy, for instance, is having volunteers go into places like nursing homes and public high schools to make sure that the recent changes to voting laws don't preclude senior women in particular from being able to vote. So they have literally trained up notaries and helping women to get their documentation, like marriage certificates from 50 years ago for some of them. And then, of course, there's always join the NAACP branch closest to you or Black Lives Matter. There are a number of ways to give your 1 hour a week or your 1 hour a month. And we strongly, strongly encourage you to remain involved because this is a marathon and not a sprint. I'll let James and Zandra each have some closing remarks. James, would you like to go first?
Sure. I just saw, and thanks, Sandra, for plugging the Manchester NAACP meeting tomorrow night. It's actually not going to be in person. We're just sending out the announcement about that. The library just told us earlier this week that we cannot have the space that we normally have. So we have to kind of pivot, and we usually have it hybrid anyway. So this will just be online, and the link, if you're interested, is on our website. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for being here. Hopefully you've gotten some ideas on what you can do. One thing I want to make sure we also call out, in addition to joining these groups, is go to your school board meeting. The school boards need some watching over, and the more people we can get who are watching over them and speaking up, the better it's going to be education, because that's really where the rubber meets the road. You can have most impact at your school board meetings.
I'll say on that note, actually, we do have some of those local teams I just mentioned, and a lot of them, the focus of that is creating public school strong teams to really focus on what are the needs in their local school community and how can they be supportive. So if that's something you're interested in, definitely reach out to me and we can either help you start one or pair you up with a local group. And that There's a whole host of education justice issues. Some communities it's around ICE, others it's about challenging book bans, others it's about supportive services for students, really trying to work together.
Again, thank you everyone for joining us. You probably received a Zoom link, an email with a Zoom link today from me that included James and Zandra's emails, so they're there. I will also include their emails in the follow-up materials that I will send to you in the next couple of days. Really grateful for your time and attention, and stay in touch. And make sure you take appropriate rests because we're in this together for the long haul. So thank you, everyone. Good night.